Thank you for being here this wonderful evening. Today, we are pleased to welcome William Powhida, our new faculty member. William Powhida is a visual artist and critic and the co-host of the podcast Explain Me with Art Absurdities, Paddy Johnson. He has BFA in painting from Syracuse University with honor and received the MFA in painting from Hunter College. He has exhibited internationally. Also, his work has been discussed in the New York Times, Artforum, Art in America, the Brooklyn Rail, Art News, and many others. Currently, he is represented in New York by Postmasters Gallery, in Seattle by Platform Gallery, in Los Angeles by Charlie James Gallery, and Copenhagen by Gallery Poulsen. His work is in the collection of the Whitney Museum, the San Diego Museum of Art, the Henley Museum, and the Orange County Museum of Art. He is best known for his drawing, How the New Museum Committed Suicide with Banality, and the show Powhida at Marlborough, Chelsea in 2011. His recent exhibition included a collaborative project, Mouth to Mouth, on housing in New York City with artist Jennifer Dalton. His first museum solo exhibition, After the Contemporary at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, and After the Contemporary at Charlie James Gallery in Los Angeles. And today, he will be sharing with us his recent works for a still untitled exhibition at Gallery Poulsen that opens November 17th in Copenhagen. With that, I ask that you give your full attention to him and help me in welcoming William Powhida.
So I'm not going to talk about a lot of my previous work. I'm not going to give you a chronological overview, but I think this piece sort of does a lot of work. Last summer, I spent a number of hours sitting around with your other faculty member, Sharon Loudon, talking about what the art world is, and she hates the term the art world. She talks about many art worlds. I'm a product of the New York City art world, specifically Williamsburg. When I graduated Hunter in 2001, I sort of walked into Williamsburg, which was, at that point, already a pretty well-established art scene, and I started writing art criticism for the Brooklyn Rail, and shortly after spending, well, about 3 years in Williamsburg writing and looking about art and trying to make it in my studio, I started to make artwork about the art world that I was experiencing. And I really think I've been trying to answer this question, like what is the art world, since about 2002 or 2003. And so I made this drawing last year after having these long conversations with Sharon and kind of mapping it out. And I'm sort of the opposite of Sharon in many ways. She's very generous and wants artists to help each other. And I've spent a good portion of my time sort of attacking other artists sort of critically, attacking the art world itself as a sort of strange institution. And so a lot of the language in my work is a little antagonistic and sort of comes out of an oppositional kind of perspective. So I'll just zoom in a little bit on this thing. And that, you know, I could probably do a lot more of these. And this particular sort of work on paper, this kind of crumpled notebook paper, is kind of also what I've developed as a kind of signature style. I'm one of two artists that make a lot of work out of big sheets of notebook paper or drawings of it. The other guy's Michael Scoggins. He's really nice, and he's got his own character named Michael Scoggins. In this one, you know, the art world might be a separated or demarcated hierarchical social space to pursue art. And the little diagram in the upper right-hand corner, the y-axis is star. The 0 point is just zero, nothing. And the x-axis is money. And so they seem to be the two major directions that define the art world. You know, it's a metaphorical condition of being apart or kind of separated from society. It's possibly the distillation of Western humanist values and class structure that comes along with that. A coded shorthand for everything that matters. So I think when people say the art world, they're trying to talk about the 100 things that seem to be on people's minds in the art world, and that changes sort of constantly. A totalizing idea to support the universality of individual taste. It's very Kantian. It could be a place, various countries, including market, academia, and institution. So we are in both institution and academia wrapped in market in Manhattan. Or cities, NYC, London, Berlin, Los Angeles, Paris, Miami, all sort of major capitals where the real estate is very expensive. It's rapidly shifting to points east or west, depending on your point of view. A cultural imaginary justifying gross inequalities. It sounds nicer than art industrial complex or high school. Crushing debt, a very large gap, and then staggering wealth, if we're talking about a continuum and not just binaries. Where you need to think in a few extra figures, a lot of zeros get attached to everything. It is both socially progressive and perhaps fiscally regressive. What if I told you Chutes and Ladders? A game no one asked us to play. Seriously. Artforum, seen, heard, and the disappearing part is just unspoken. An opaque system that masks so many things. This is a quote from the film The Thing. Every piece of you is self-sufficient, an animal unto itself. So when I think people talk about the art world as a community, I sort of think of it as a community of competing cells rather than the whole. Soaring peaks, parched deserts, lonely swamps. This is an art collector, a Belgian guy. Nation of sheep owned by pigs, ruled by wolves. An expanded and overpopulated field surrounded by fences. A site of perpetual and symbolic ideological conflict. Right now, price is the measure of success, and I'm not doing so well in that case. Art news, top 200 collectors, artsy times number of artists, RY. Basically some sort of formula. The elevation and celebration of individual genius. A private event for cool kids with a celebrity artist DJ. Or a monastery for serious artists working in isolation until death. This is a reference to, perhaps if anyone's ever read Philip K. Dick, there's a book called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, where the narrator realizes that he's living inside someone else's subjective reality. So sometimes I think we all live in Jerry's world. The consensus reality of the ruling class, or the false consciousness of basically everyone else. A microcosm of the world with a little bit more pretension. This is important. Never quite what you'd hoped for, and by you, I mean me. And it's obviously a very long story, and sometimes I think it's really just sort of an erotic fantasy of desire, what everyone wants. People want something out of this art world. So this piece is about 45 inches tall, 55 inches tall and 45 inches wide. It's 5 times the normal scale of a sheet of notebook paper, and it's sort of a plastic coated paper mounted on aluminum that then I have to sort of wrestle into that shape of crumpled paper. And I ended up making these at this scale after spending many years just doing them as very small scale drawings. So this is, I think, the first one of these I ever made in my studio. It's about 5 by 7, and it's just graphite on paper. And I made this in about 2005 when I went to see the Greater New York exhibition, which is sort of this, I don't know, whatever, every 5 years they do these surveys at PS1. And it was about this big, big Dana Schutz painting. It was like the biggest painting I'd ever seen by a living artist. And I was writing criticism at that point for the Brooklyn Rail, sort of very serious criticism under my real name. And I kind of thought about what it would be like to share some of my less serious thoughts and kind of start to develop a sort of more deranged critical voice that would get into my own sort of biases or feelings, because I was also making art at that time. And Dana was one of two artists I became sort of obsessed with, like Jules de Balancourt. They were artists who went right from like graduate school to the Venice Biennale or right to auction. And I was very curious about this phenomenon of like the art star and why a certain kind of expressionist painting was being received so well sort of critically and by the art market, which was starting to boom at that time. It was already pretty well underway. But just to be clear, here's Dana. This is a painting, Last Man on Earth from Observation. It sold for 181,000 pounds. And my drawing on the right sold for $2,375 in 2010. And so that's where my sort of price points are in a lot of ways. And Dana has continued to do very well despite any recent controversy. So I'm going to skip to work that I'm currently, that's still in my studio. I'm working on a show that I'm trying to figure out the title for. It'll probably end up just be called The Contemporary. But this is a timeline that I've been working on since July. And it comes out of a show I did at the Aldrich called After the Contemporary, which was a kind of satirical look from the year 2100 back at like this period of time that we're sort of currently in. Which, like the period of modern art, I'm saying that the year 2000 to about 2025 will just be called the contemporary, our shorthand for like, I'm a contemporary artist. It's contemporary artwork. At a certain point, maybe it'll just be frozen in time and we'll say we do other things. But so this sort of charts out 25 years of the art world. And right around now, 2018, it breaks from a kind of historical analysis of the art world, our sort of social and political realities, some of the technological developments or popular culture developments, and moves forward up until a sort of fictionalized or speculative fiction kind of representation of where I think our society and our art world might be headed. And on the bottom portion is a longer timeline from the year 1900 to 2050 that sort of maps out the graph is income inequality. It's the top 10% of how much wealth the top 10% of society controls in the US. And so this drawing is about 83.5 inches by 53 inches tall, and it's all watercolor and a little bit of graphite on paper. And I just had someone come in and take a medium format photograph of this. And so at the beginning of the time period, I'm sort of saying starts in about 2000. It's fairly arbitrary. What I think is that for me, the kind of contemporary moment really started with Art Basel Miami Beach and this kind of orientation of art to the art fair and really sort of like that functioning as just a symbol of the importance of the art market over sort of critical values. I know a while back I had a conversation with Mark Tribe, and we were talking about sort of what we valued in art. And I just remember thinking that like the 90s, you know, there was a real value placed on critical theory and dialogue around art. And by the time I came into the art world in the 2000s, that seemed to have sort of gone out the window in favor of just like panel discussions at the art fair with wealthy collectors and some star curators. And the orientation or the hierarchy of this thing is sort of the art world floats on top of social and political events. So something that I've been trying to figure out in that question of like what is the art world is in 2002, well, the initial Art Basel Miami Beach was supposed to debut in 2001, and it was canceled out of security concerns after 9/11. And in that kind of span, right around that time of 2002 in December, you've got this sort of amazing, huge social party that erupts in Miami Beach with, you know, an enormous amount of wealthy collectors and artists going down there to sell lots of artwork. And shortly after that, you have the global Iraq War protests, where they were the largest protests in the history of the world. And that's something that I couldn't quite reconcile as an artist, that you had this kind of party-like atmosphere that was developing while the world seemed to be sort of sliding into, well, a very long slide to our present moment. And beneath that, let's see these, they're sort of very small watercolors of some of the events and portraits of our presidents, the United States that we've had, and some of their policies that they passed that I thought were sort of notable to give some context for like the art world that's happening on top. And down at the bottom, this sort of comes at the end of the dot-com bubble, sort of bursts in 2000. And at the same time, very shortly after that, Amazon reports its first quarterly profit. So I've always found it ironic that a lot of people lost some money on some really bad startup ideas in the early 2000s, but it was just the beginning of like the dot-com era. And also, it was right around 2001, Napster shuts down. And so the actual kind of peer-to-peer sharing of culture, the idea that maybe culture wants to be free, is over, and it's the beginning of like sharing in name only, that you're just going to have to pay subscription fees for everything. And so it moves along through time. And for me, I think the sort of largest event that shaped a lot of my practice and what I think about art was the kind of financial crisis in 2008. And it was sort of at that moment that some of my thoughts about the art world got even more complicated. Because in previous times when the economy was booming and there was a stock market crash, it sort of took the art world with it. Like in '89 when the stock market crashed happened in New York, a lot of galleries closed. There was a lot of impact. But in this case, I mean, there was like a bad, 2008 art fair, but people still came back the next year, and it seemed to kind of take off into another level. And so in that, like 2005, there were about 68 art fairs around the world. And I think, where is it? By 2015, there's like 289 art fairs worldwide. And that just sort of speaks to the kind of incredible growth of the art market, that while all that's happening, it takes a couple of years for it to really sink in, but by 2011, you have the Occupy Wall Street protests break out. And at that point, some of my own work started to move out of the studio and into more activist circles, working with like Occupy Wall Street's arts and labor movement. Out of some of this, time, I think there was an overlap, certainly with a lot of people working in the art world, with starting to address the kind of like material reality of sort of being an artist, where you've got this industry that's grown, and people talk about it in terms of like $56 billion a year industry, and a lot of people making money. And then the idea that like interns aren't getting paid, or that artists need to be paid for their labor. Wage, which I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but it's the working artists in the greater economy. Sharon Loudon hopefully has talked about it. They are starting to push for artists' remuneration and not working for free. And at that time period, there's the hopeful election of the Obama administration. The first Iron Man movie comes out, the first Marvel comic book movie. And something I've just been thinking about is the idea of like sort of franchises and brands, and that kind of overlap between artists and a kind of developing a brand identity or sort of selling yourself. And of course the iPhone came out, and many social media things that we're all familiar with were starting to emerge at that time. Twitter, Tumblr, YouTube. And just some things that I thought were sort of notable publications or texts around that time were Andrea Fraser's Les 1% C'est Moi, where she's sort of asking if the art world really is part of the 1%. It's also notable that Nato Thompson, who was part of Creative Time for a long time, opened this amazing socially engaged art show right around the same time that Occupy Wall Street broke out and tried to have a meeting with them. And the Occupy Wall Street people were like, no, we don't want your institutional whatever, get out of here. And it sort of was one of the biggest shows that I think no one paid attention to because the social engaged art was happening in Zuccotti Park for real. Alex Rule and David Levine published International Art English, which I think is a fantastic essay if you haven't read it, about the way in which a lot of these values get distilled in the way we write and talk about art, particularly in press releases. But even by 2013, there is some concern that the art world is starting to kind of bifurcate or transform in ways that are a little bit frightening. So this Belgian collector, Elaine Servet, sort of advanced this go or grow art market thesis, that you either have to get bigger and open more spaces or raise your prices or expand your studio or just get out. And this is sort of happening as some galleries are starting to close, there's some pressure. And at the same time, Frieze starts a second art fair week in New York. So the art fairs are metastasizing in some way. And it was around that time that Walter Robinson coined the term zombie formalism to describe a whole strain of sort of abstraction cut off from perhaps meaning. And in 2015, this is also a sort of in-joke in the way that I work with text and image, the Greater New York show happens in 2015, but the Broad opened in LA and sort of starts to represent a kind of struggle or shift from New York to the West Coast as maybe the art capital of New York. Gagosian opened his 16th gallery in San Francisco. And as we get up to the sort of present moment, we start to see a lot of other movements that are sort of happening along the way, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, the Women's March around Trump, and which sort of turned into the Me Too movement. And there's so many sort of ironies. It's sort of we basically agree to enter the Paris Climate Accord, and as soon as Trump's elected, he announces that we are not going to enter the Paris Climate Accord as Hurricane Maria strikes that fall. And right around here, at this point, we enter the land of sort of speculative fiction. And one of the ideas that I was thinking about with the show that I did at the Aldrich last spring was this idea of doing like sort of genre-based artwork or working with some of the tropes of science fiction and sort of speculating about the future based on current events. And there's a writer, thinker named Claire Evans who has a really great talk that you can find online. It was part of the Walker Museum's Superscript conference in 2015. Where she really talked about science fiction and speculative fiction as a tool that artists could use for critical thought. And I've been thinking about that for a while. So it definitely enters the land of sci-fi. And unfortunately, none of this, there's no good outcome here. Thinking about the trajectory we've been on since the first President George Bush initiated, to some degree, many of the policies in 2000 that and things that we're still engaged with, it continues to sort of slide in a direction of sort of patriarchal privilege that favors the very wealthy. And so there are some awful things that potentially could happen, like Roe v. Wade being overturned by the Roberts-led Supreme Court. Some other things that I just throw in, like maybe Betsy DeVos gets shot and killed by a parent of a school shooting victim who's upset. And this idea of kind of the art world growing growing and leaving our general kind of sense of being attached to society. Gagosian and Zwerner sort of merge. Sotheby's and Christie's merge and create SAC Holdings. And what sort of marks, I guess, the end of the contemporary is Hurricane Don comes through and submerges Miami Beach. And it sort of cancels the last version of Art Basel. And what takes its place is Art Basel Thailand. It's not a misspelling of Thailand. It's based on the idea that one of the threads that sort of runs through the whole bottom of this timeline is that the sort of disruptive investor, Peter Thiel, who some of you may know is the guy who funded the Hulk Hogan lawsuit that shut down Gawker, or a very early Facebook investor, or the guy who says he wants transfusions of young people's blood to stay alive longer. He was on Trump's tech council. He's talked openly about buying a small island in the Pacific to create his own sovereign micronation, where like rich people get so rich that they don't want to follow anyone's laws but their own, kind of libertarian techno-futurist nightmare. So he buys an island, and Art Basel has a VIP invitation-only event hosted on the island you can reach by private jet or yacht. And it's really the end of this kind of idea that there's a democratic premise to art, that art galleries are open to the public, that we make art for the public, whatever that sort of is, and just an acknowledgement that a lot of contemporary art has been produced for the very wealthiest segment of our society. And at that point, there's much less art fairs. That probably tracks that there's a lot less galleries that are open, which I think, you probably, if you're paying attention at all to the number of art galleries in New York, a lot of them are sort of closing, especially at the sort of mid-level range. And there's certainly a lot of new galleries opening, but part of my question about what the art world is it going to have a middle anymore? And a lot of this comes out of at least some of, I don't know if anyone's read Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, but it's a very long, in-depth, research-based analysis of income inequality really over the last century. And he tracks sort of 3 major data sets and basically comes to the conclusion that if wealth and income inequality continue to diverge in the way they are now, that it poses an existential threat to our democratic institutions. And so if you get that feeling like we're leaving a long experiment of democracy, you're not wrong. His book was pretty well attacked by a lot of establishment figures because he thinks a lot of the free market premises that the United States domestic policy has been based on were just flat out wrong, in part because so much of what people thought were natural developments came out of very progressive tax policies that redistributed wealth following World War II. So you can see this kind of cliff where suddenly rich people don't have as much of they're not taking so much of the share of income. And this isn't a graph of like wealth inequality, that's even worse and more long-term. But this trough that is sort of created from 1940 to just about the time Reagan's elected in 1980 is really sort of where the American middle class exists. And there's a fantastic book called The Transformation of the Avant-Garde, written by Diana Crane. And it's a sociological look. It's sort of the transformation of our idea of the sort of prototypical American movement of abstract expressionism into, and she associates that with the avant-garde, kind of aesthetic movement that's going to really challenge established aesthetic values and norms. And she says it sort of transforms into a moyen garde, or a middle garde, sort of a middle class art world that I think a lot of us are still sort of existing in, and sort of think about that art can be a profession where you earn money or you get a teaching job and it's relatively stable. But she also tracks how the kind of aesthetics of art change with that notion. And it's definitely worth reading, but as income inequality has continued to rise, it does propose this idea that without that sort of trough, that there is no space for a middle class. And that's not going to, it barely addresses the fact that we still have a working class, we have working poor, we have a whole range of people that don't even fall into this kind of aspirational space of a middle class. But it's maybe sort of like part of the possibility of some mobility or a more egalitarian society. And so there is one red line that sort of runs across the top of this, and it's about 60%. And that figure, the last time we had such extreme income inequality was in the Ancien regime in France, so sort of pre-revolutionary aristocratic society. And we're on our way there. We're almost there now. And so this sort of area is just the kind of pullout of the 25-year period on the top. And this kind of space on the right side is sort of what follows the contemporary. And it moves into some sort of satirical, sad, dystopian predictions. We move into the alt-contemporary period of art. There is no longer a sort of moyen guard or middle guard, there's a haute guard. The gallery system sort of gives way to a franchise system, which is just taking the idea of like an investment tranche and a franchise, so that perhaps you have Gagosian and Werner producing Kusama's forever after she's dead. They own the intellectual property and they just continue to make infinity rooms infinitely. There is the sort of middle class gives way to a society dominated by an ultra class. And a lot of this is just plays on, if you've ever read a TFAF art market report, they always talk about ultra high net worth individuals. And they're like the target audience for art market sales. So they just become a class in this world. Neoliberalism shifts into a kind of neo-feudal period where a lot of people are doing service work around this kind of ultra-class subject. And one of the things Piketty does in his book is he uses literature from the 1800s to kind of look at what constitutes a human being. And it's only people with a certain amount of wealth. Everyone else is a peripheral figure that plays some role, like a tailor or a driver, or, a farmer or a renter, but they're not fully realized people. And it feels like we're shifting back towards that. There's a brief class war. We lose. The constitutional democratic republic of the United States just gives way to a flat-out paternal oligarchy. There are a series of wars. There's just too many. Like, I couldn't even think about how many were going to happen, so I just called them the international resource wars. The internet still exists, but the World Wide Web is replaced by Peter Thiel's proprietary system called Panoptier. So if anyone's read your Panopticon texts, it's just bad. And then our period of sort of globalism gives way to a period of siloization. You could just call it balkanization, or the idea of sort of horrible nationalist trend of retreating into shells of nations and further into other forms of fractured spaces, which are great conditions if you are wealthy and are hoping climate change will dispense with a lot of the population. Or you're planning on decamping to the moon or Mars to live out your life. The reason why Kanye's up here is Trump tries to suspend US elections and just take over as a king or something, but he's removed from office because he's an idiot, and Kanye West is appointed to be the next president. So a lot of the stuff in the timeline is written out in a series of museum wall didactics that I made for the show at the Aldrich, but I think hopefully it is sort of a standalone piece at this point. Another way that I tried to sort of convey this timeline, for about the last year and a half, I've been working on a series of Artforum ads, and they follow the same basic timeline. They start in 2000. This is a real Petzl ad that looks a lot, the color scheme, after I started, I was like, wow, it looks like a Rothko. But it begins in 2000, and I did a series, they're in my studio right now. These are 35 by 35 inch watercolors that will be mounted on aluminum and sort of crumpled into paper forms, but it's a very condensed timeline. This is from 2009. This is Damien Hirst's show where he went back to painting after he did his own auction right like the night before this whole financial crisis played out, where like Lehman went bankrupt the next day, and he made a killing. And so I just always thought it was funny. His next show was like a skull submerging into water. Like he maybe had some self-awareness that things were over, or he was over, which are not the case, unfortunately. This is an Yves Saint Laurent ad from 2015, and one of the things I've been doing with these is trying to sort of pick out the relationships that are set up within Artforum, which always include like 2 or 3 designers, and they're usually depictions of women, high fashion brands that sort of coexist. They're like the only other kinds of ads that are allowed into Artforum, which is sort of an interesting thing to think about for contemporary art trying to be a sort of progressive sphere. And then we move into the future. This is an ad for Eddie Martinez's show Corpses that will be at Blum, Poe, and Kordansky in Los Angeles in 2020. This one uses a little bit more than watercolor. To get a proper Eddie Martinez, I had to use some spray paint and pastels. It was shockingly hard to paint and really bad still. And then this is the last ad of this series, and it's a show, Powhida, at the end of his story. And I'm working on a video currently based on some footage I shot at the Headlands with an actor who played a character also called William Powhida, who I did a number of shows about and used as sort of a tool to sort of make fun of my own complicity and privilege and place in the art world. And in this case, he's just in the upper right-hand corner overlooking the bluffs in Marin County at this really lovely residency. And it's really kind of silly. These will ultimately look more like this. These are 3 that I made last year for Miami. And it's a little mini commentary on the position Artforum found itself in, with Knight Landesman being accused of sexual harassment and having to leave Artforum. In the timeline, I forgot to mention, Jeff Koons dies in 2023 in an Uber self-driving car accident on his way to his home in Pennsylvania. So they do, of course, a show in heaven. And then I'm going to kind of try to run through these pretty quickly. For the show in Copenhagen, I'm reconstituting this timeline of 15-inch by 15-inch art forms. And they're, up until about 2013, all real ads. Some of them I just find incredibly creepy or weird. Other ones I sort of chose because I think they capture something a little bit of what the contemporary moment was. This is the creepy one. This is like weird man hands holding a little baby. And of course, Prada ad. Early 2000s Koons show, easy fun. And some of them I'm just choosing because I think they have very nice color schemes or appeal to my design sensibility. And also starting to kind of identify the sort of transformations that have already happened within the art world. But at some point, Zwirner and Wirth were showing together, or aligned. I just like this one. Minimal artists trying to make something look like nothing, and conceptual artists try to make nothing look like something. Or is it the other way around? There are always these shows. They just keep coming up, like painters versus sculptors, or figure versus abstraction. Sad Clown, Jim Shaw, Cindy Sherman in the Marc Jacobs. This was the era when Marc Jacobs completely dominated fashion. sort of started to take over Bleecker Street. But this sort of connection between fine art and high fashion, there's always this sort of play, delicate play between the two worlds, and of course photographed by Jürgen Teller. Dana Schutz, Panic. I thought this one was a little scary because I feel like this is a preview of 2020 if Trump gets reelected. And these Saatchi triumph of painting shows were sort of ubiquitous. I think he did quite a bit to sort of help develop certain careers, especially of the YBA artists, but also really to sort of like market his own collection through exhibitions and push marketing into the institutions. Or you could go back and see his Sensation show at the Brooklyn Museum in 2000. Manifesto, yeah, for like abstractionists and friends of the non-objective. White Cube. This just struck me as a totally strange ad for Jeremy Blake, who committed suicide by walking into the ocean with stones in his pockets. Deschanel died of a drug overdose in a boutique hotel in Soho. Shortly after that, Tracy Emin. Younger Than Jesus, which is a show, if you haven't seen it, it's worth going back and sort of looking at. It established Ryan Trecarton's career, and he ended up curating, I think, the next biennial, or maybe two after this one, or triennial. Barclay. And also, sort of noticing some of the shift of galleries into China and into the East, looking and sort of following the growth of economies there and sort of concentrating where money finds itself. James Steinbach. And the idea that, at a certain point, the sort of mega galleries like Zwerner are consolidating estates of artists. Dead or alive, if you're selling, they are going to get you and sell your work. So like Christie said, the show is over. The audience get up to leave their seats. Time to collect their coats and go home. They turn around. No more coats and no more home. So threatening. And then the Rain Room, I'm sure some of you maybe have experienced this piece or gone to it, but it was the one that was, like, it was a mystery for a minute who made the Rain Room, and it turned out to be it was by Random International, and it was sponsored by Restoration Hardware, which briefly had a contemporary art gallery. But it felt like it was the first kind of like designed contemporary art piece that was almost authorless, sort of design collective, which sort of posed this idea that maybe part of the future of contemporary art is post-artist, that the kind of individual concerns that we have maybe won't be relevant. I think Hyperallergic just published a piece I was reading on my way over here about the Museum of Pizza that just opened. And the headline is like, the Museum of Pizza owes its artists an apology. And I'm very curious about that, because I want to know if it actually involved artists or just a sort of team of designers. And so this is the last of the sort of historical ads, and the rest of them are invented future narratives. Contemporary art selling in storage space using blockchain technology. And Christie's just announced that they're going to do the first major sale using blockchain authentication technology. It's a little creepy. A Banks Violet Pride show, which he did a show in like 2013 where he used the number 88. And in the press release, it sort of referenced Dale Earnhardt's racing number, but it's also code for Heil Hitler. So it's a legitimate question, like, is he examining racism or is he participating in it? This will happen. MoMA bought Sarah's Equal. It's just giant squares of steel, and it's going to be permanently installed in the new building. Sean Kelly has made ads sort of like this, but I just thought the sentiment of them, maybe this would be a question, you know, whoever said the art world was fair. And Imhoff's Faust is permanently installed in Abu Dhabi. And the only thing I kind of like about this idea is that like white hipster goth types, health goths, would be trapped in the desert for the rest of their lives or rotated in and out, you know, just to be viewed like a contemporary art petting zoo with humans. Bobby Ainsbach is a real artist, but I thought maybe Tiffany Zabludovich would open her own gallery and you know, just use an Instagram photo as a full-page ad in Artforum. Josh Smith is still painting in 2020. The Guggenheim does another political show, Radical Asymmetries, Contemporary Art from the West Asian Conflict Zones. Petra shows some new paintings. And so the narrative, the timeline is sort of built into these Artforum ads. Some of these I hope won't be necessary. So Jeff Koons does Da Vinci in white plaster, the blue gazing ball. Prince gets a retrospective at the Walker. Kanye designs Nazi boots named after Trump. Gagosian continues to open spaces. If you haven't heard of Nate Hill, he's got an ongoing performance right now called I'm Dead. This is an image of a piece he did called Death Bear, where he would go and take objects of pain from people. There's a really sort of fantastic, I think, New York Magazine piece where the writer of the article talks about giving up his failed novel to the Death Bear and revisiting it like 5 years later. It's just still in a kind of storage space. Some more creepy white kind of power ads. I think Balenciaga actually worked for the fascists in World War II. So these kind of cyclical relationships keep coming back. That was a really awful stock photo. Sorry, it seemed to capture some of what happens. There's an image of a show called Slow, which to me, it's both a sort of pun, but also, you know, is a sort of countervailing moment to the rapidity of like images and just immersion that, you know, there seems to be one of the counters to a lot of this might be just trying to slow things down or to get people to be more present and spend time. And I think this one could happen. Gradients. There are a lot of gradients now. Postmasters, the gallery I show with in New York, is one of like 2 or 3 galleries that has started a Patreon model to sort of find alternate sources of funding. So it seemed like at some point ADA and NADA might merge and just set up a general Patreon to keep galleries open and free to the public. This is an ad for the Museum of Nothing. It will be a museum with nothing, no light, no sound. You just go stand in the dark. The jogging retrospective at the new museum. Sorry, Mark Rhizome is going to organize this one. Mark Tansey, privacy. This is just a page from Artforum. I'm sort of thinking about writing a critical piece on the Marvel series as an artist I know named John Powers who sort of likes the Marvel universe. So he's not thrilled with this idea of having his name attached to this project. Los Angeles Open Studios in 2024 will be sponsored by the self-driving Uber cars to get you around to all those studios. Leo opens his collection in Thousand Palms, California, on your way to Joshua Tree. A memorial ad for students who were shot by police during student debt protests in Chicago. And yeah, they opened a giant Richard Serra Torque de Lips hotel at the airport. And Crozier has its storage right attached to it. And I think maybe the last one's the Frieze Art Fair in, I guess what will be called South LA, and what is now sort of South Central. This is an installation shot of 120 or the setting up the show in Los Angeles where the sort of first iteration of these Artforum paintings were shown. And they were all made with the idea that they were going to be part of this catalog, which I produced in collaboration, a sort of asymmetrical collaboration with a very wealthy young funder, sort of patron. We ended up only printing 50 of them, but it includes the 120 of the watercolor ads. And so the nice thing about this is it gave me an excuse to price these at about $1,500 as opposed to say like $5,000 or $6,000 for a small work on paper. And it turned out to be a sort of lucrative endeavor, which sort of gets to the heart of one of the conflicts of my practice that you can sort of ask about, is what does it mean to sort of bite the hand that feeds you or criticize a system in which I still benefit from it? Because with this project, I feel like there was this sort of terrible practice where they were feeding cows their own brains and their own, like, they're cannibalizing cows in the meat industry. And they stopped it because they thought maybe it was contributing to the development of mad cow disease, like that kind of like feedback loop was terrible. And in some way, I feel like I'm feeding back marketing or ads to collectors who sort of buy these things when they could just get a copy of Artforum. So it's definitely a little bit strange. So hopefully this catalog will come back into the world and published in another way, or a revised version with many of the new ones. And just a couple of the references that I didn't get to Ward Shelley, but that's the Claire Evans superscript talk. Ward Shelley is an artist whose sort of maps have inspired some of mine. Wage is sort of great if you want to look at any kind of self-regulation in the art world to address some of the issues that I raised. And Diana Crane's Transformation of the Avant-Garde, wonderful book. The first chapter alone is sort of worth everything. And Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century is a real commitment. It's like 400 pages of historical data, but the fourth part of that book is sort of an amazing policy recommendation. So I will stop there and open it up to questions.
Hi. I really enjoyed your talk. I just have a question because you mentioned how there's no middle art world anymore, really. What do you think, how do you think Instagram and social media kind of play into that, or maybe helping it in a way or not?
You know, I think it's done a lot. I was at a panel of all-female dealers at NYU a couple of months ago, and they were asked what was the biggest change in like the art market. And one of the first responses was Instagram. Just the fact that it has opened up so many ways of sort of thinking about getting your work in front of someone. For dealers, they sell work through Instagram. I think it's given a lot more access to work, but then the sort of thing kicks back in, how does that work? Is it like, can artists live off that and just sell their work through Instagram? Or how do you find work within such huge, vast numbers of, you know, artists? I'm personally, I think it's just like a kind of really fascinating economy. I was sort of tempted to just pull up my own Instagram account and like look at like likes on different works, you know, because I think my most popular Instagram post is just a blank sheet of paper. I'm like, oh, what are you trying to say? You know, like, should I, okay. No, but I think it's had a tremendous change on like so many things. I mean, the way Twitter has sort of changed arts journalism, the way that we sort of communicate with each other, and maybe not all positive for sure, but I think it's changed a lot of things. It's hard to get more specific than that.
In regards to the, excuse me, the timeline contemporary piece. I'm curious how you stay motivated as an artist with kind of your bleak outlook on the future. And for young artists, your audience, why should we make art? And kind of how should we stay motivated?
Well, I hope you like making art, right? Like, in the absence of anyone paying attention or even having an audience, that there's something intrinsic about making work that you would do if no one asked you to do it or no one wanted to give you anything in exchange for it. I mean, I've been drawing since I was a little kid, and I've just been trying to find ways to like channel my own despair or depression into something that's a little bit, transform it into something a little bit more positive. So I hope that you can stay motivated. I mean, when I left Hunter, it was right after 9/11, and many of us were just asking, like, what's the role or purpose of art in the face of such sort of catastrophe? The election of George Bush was hugely depressing, the Iraq War. And so there was a lot of attempts to sort of like be political, but it also comes with the realization that like the art world's maybe not the best place for actual political activism. It excels at symbolic representations of things. And they can be useful in different ways than getting involved in like a community organization. I think the act of making art in itself is worth, it has its own value system that I hope doesn't get attached to all of these other things. And you have to kind of create that space in your studio or your practice for you to be able to continue to make work. Because I do think it's incredibly relevant. And I don't know if anyone saw that painting that Trump has in the White House now. It's like a Star Wars cantina scene that's been lifted and replaced with Republican presidents. I think we have an obligation to produce better art than that, for the future.
Thank you again for your talk. It's very enjoyable. I'm also kind of a cynical person, so I feel that. So my question is kind of playing off of what Jennifer was asking. You have certain artists like, say, Brad Trammell, who has really capitalized, in this very excellent way, kind of taking the idea of the institution, turning it around and making it look at its ugly self in the mirror, and then capitalizing to a degree, in a relatively sustainable way. So I guess like my thought is that, through chronology, I think that we're kind of in a place, personally, I believe we're kind of in a place where, art is either being very like heavy in identity politics, as well as, just kind of like this regurgitation of fury, through the politics and the entire, system. And we have a lot of, individuals. And I think that you touched on that in that list, this kind of like the swamp of a bunch of people like selves instead of being a collective. So I was wondering what your opinion is of like where you think if we're in this kind of down here of, art for the individual, art for, the politically motivated, for the self and identity politics, where do you see that going now? Do you see it kind of like more people, having the accessibility of Instagram and the art market taking off in that way? Or like, I just wanted to know what your thoughts were.
It's taken on a lot of different forms. I was just thinking about, have you heard of the collective Meow Wolf? No. It's based out of Santa Fe, and it started, I think, in like 2008 or 2009 with like 40 artists that wanted to sort of make a living or find some other way of making art as sort of a collective, and ended up creating a kind of funhouse of contemporary art. And then now it's a full-on corporation. I think the artists who work there have dispensed with any sense of like individual authorship within the funhouse. They now collect a salary. I think they make like $45,000 a year. They might get benefits. And they've sort of traded that individual expression for just a job, making something that looks like contemporary art. That seems to be one sort of proposal for, and I don't, I'm not advocating for this, but I can kind of see this path forward that like, in a sort of corporate way, you could just dispense with the artist, start to figure out ways to monetize this sort of thing that we do, and give up that kind of individual expression. I think during Occupy Wall Street, there were two groups. Arts and Labor was sort of concerned with what do you do if you're an artist working in the system? How might we reform it or change it to make it a little bit more redistributive and help people survive? The other hand, like arts and culture was the other flip side of that. And I think they were trying to find material forms of like, how do we make art collectively that are less about the individual? And I think that's very hard. I don't have any training or experience in that. I mean, I think there's a history in Mexico where there were a lot of grupos and groups that were anonymous collectives. And it was really interesting, like Carlos Salinas, the president of Mexico at the time, wanted to diminish that and created FONCA grants, which were only given to individual artists. And so it was like a wedge into these collectives where out of that emerge individual artists that can be bought and sold in our familiar way. Another way that I think about this is that the writer Ben Davis has sort of talked about like, climate change is coming, there's no ifs, ands, or buts, and we have a lot of dystopian images of that. But his sort of question is, are artists going to make sort of positive images of how we get through that? And it's sort of really taking that kind of question of despair and just sort of working with it. My sort of main concern is that the art world that we know it or the way we prepare for it is just, there's not going to be much of a middle for it. There'll be a place where you can show and exhibit, maybe start your own Tiger Strikes Asteroid, sort of artist collective, but there won't be that kind of ladder to becoming the next Dana Schutz or Jeff Koons or something, which is pretty dismal. So I don't know exactly how this is all going to play out, even with my speculations on it.
And I have another question, sorry if I'm taking anyone else's turn. I was wondering, the first point that you had made about, it's kind of like driving that wedge in between the group of the artists, kind of taking away and separating that. I was just curious about what your opinion of Harmony Korine's Blockbuster show at the Gagosian is.
I have not. Is that up?
Yes.
No, I haven't seen it yet.
Okay. Well, I'm interested in what
Okay.
may come out of that, or what you think.
It could be a topic for discussion on the podcast with Paddy.
Yeah.
Oh, there's.
Is that okay? So one thing, thank you so much, Bill. In the spirit of skepticism, I find your predictions really entertaining. Well, clearly, I feel like if you can go back to your big timeline, your analysis of the past is kind of indisputably accurate, and I love the way you layer, the art world sort of floats on top of politics, on top of technology, and then on top of economics, right? When you get to the future,
which area?
Well, I'm just saying, when you get beyond 2018 and you get into the realm of speculative fiction, because we're here in a room with all of our students, I want to caution you guys not to listen to this guy. Because he does not know, he does not have a crystal ball. And it's dark, and it's predicated on the assumption that a set of negative trends will continue, more or less uninterrupted, which presumes that we can predict the macro forces that produce those trends. And a couple of big things are happening that make it really difficult to predict in these ways. One is changes in technology, particularly what's known in the field as HLMR, high-level machine intelligence, or artificial intelligence, like machine learning, automation. Carlos, I saw that.
Skeptical.
Okay. About that?
About generally technology saving us, yes.
I'm not saying it's going to save us at all, but that it's going to throw wrenches in the works that are really hard, that I feel like you haven't been taken into account for. And then also just the massive crises that I think are going to flow out of runaway climate change, assuming it runs away. and in which case your predictions may be really optimistic.
Yeah,
But
no, I mean, this was done before the recent report came out that said we've got like a decade to change.
Is there any news in that report that we didn't already know, though? I mean,
Not really. No, and I just finished reading Kim Stanley Robinson's 2140, which is, New York City has been fully submerged, basically, except, the cloisters and part of the Upper West Side. I mean, one of the things he warns about in the book is trying to isolate any single cause. There's like a fallacy that you could just say all of this is going to happen because of X.
Yeah.
But he also does spend an inordinate amount of time talking about wealth and income inequality. He's sort of like having that dialogue with himself through the narrators. But I do think that is the sort of one constant in why I sort of reference Piketty and, the fact that I think there was more writing about Piketty's book than actually went into his book, trying to discredit it, in part because it does have such a dire prediction that if this divergence continues, it really does pose like an existential threat to our whole way of being. And I guess I just don't take it for granted that it's going to continue.
I certainly hope it doesn't continue. It could be that it was the two world wars that did the massive income redistribution. Not only it begins with the New Deal, right? Mm-hmm. And but also the wars destroyed a ton of wealth. And who knows? Like maybe artificial intelligence, automation, and global warming will be the next equivalent of the next world wars that destroy wealth and end up with radical redistribution and the emergence potentially of new governance models?
That would be an upside potentially of the blockchain, because one of Piketty's proposals is that we just need a global wealth tax, and he says from 0% to 2%, and people are like, why would you propose a 0% wealth tax? And he's like, just for the auditing, just to know how much wealth there really is on the globe, because the way that we run deficits and it seems like there must be some wealth stored on Mars. We just don't have that accurate accounting. And his main argument for that is if you want economic democracy, you need that accounting. You need to know where it is and how to get it back into society. One, to fight climate change. It's like the coal industry the other day was saying that they want to start arguing for carbon capture technology, which is, we don't have the technology yet and it's too expensive, but they're advocating for it so they can keep burning coal. I mean, It's a little bit crazy.
Okay, the follow-up just has to do with institutional critique, which was this really productive, I don't want to call it a movement, but a tendency in art in the 1970s and 80s primarily, and into the 90s.
Hans Haacke is the grandfather.
Andrea Fraser, and you name it. And I think it maybe had some salutary effects on the institutions that were being critiqued, primarily museums and not so much the market. So you, I feel like, are using tools and techniques, or at least strategies, of institutional critique and turning your lens more on a new set of contemporary institutions, which are emerging market mechanisms like art fairs and stuff like that. Do you see parallels there? Were those artists influential or instrumental for you in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hans Haacke's piece on the provenance of, is it like the Monet painting or Renoir? I forget the exact painting, but the idea of looking at ownership and sort of challenging institutions where you're actually following the money and sort of doing it through art itself was sort of opened up an area of saying, okay, I can use art as the thing, but the subject of the critique and the vehicle of it. Andrea Fraser, she moved it into like totally different areas. I mean, I think about her work quite often. And she just published a book now that sort of looks at the connections between collectors and their campaign donations, and like getting very specific about it and not trying to ignore the fact that on one hand, we're a very progressive sphere, culturally, very liberal, politically, and then most of our sources of money are on a very different continuum to very, I would say a lot of them are libertarian in their mindset. They're socially progressive, but then very fiscally conservative. And Andrea Fraser is also called institutional critique. It's become an institution of critique. And I think that's the danger. And then we also have Banksy, which was like, what was that? Did you see the shredded sort of immediately, it's a new artwork. Didn't destroy value, it just sort of recreated a new set of values. So I still think that the art world needs a lot of institutional critique from within. And I think it has shifted, though, with groups like Wage, out of just being symbolic in the realm of art into actual negotiations with institutions. So now they have a new project called Wagency, where individual artists can get certified to be wagents. It's all new language, it's a little clunky and weird, but you can ask Wage to negotiate on your behalf with institutions to try to get you paid. And they're consciously sort of ignoring the market because it's so much more difficult to... I was working with another artist who was trying to put together a kind of survey or questionnaire to sort of like with a nice goal of maybe trying to help mid-level galleries. But when she spoke to a few people who work, like gallery directors who worked in these galleries, she was like, I could never get, say, my dealer, I could never speak for my dealer. It would be very hard to get her to commit to like working with any sort of change. And we can kind of see it in the art fairs right now. They're trying to offer sliding scales for the booth fees because they recognize that they're maybe by doubling the rent for a business that they're killing the gallery, like they're killing their source of income. So there is some attempt at self-regulation in it, but it seems like a little bit too late at this point in almost saving like the kind of brick and mortar gallery space. But this is pretty much the work that I've sort of been engaged in over the last decade or so, and I don't have answers yet, Mark. I think a lot of them are still in progress.
So I feel like I don't feel like a lot of your work, but your work is heavily invested in the art world. There's this critique on that. But outside of just the art world, like what are you interested in? Like there's a lot of like text. Could you just talk about like your craft and like the way that you work? Not so much just like the content.
Well, yeah, I mean, I never really felt like a good artist in that sense. Like, I admit that I really like drawing. I had an idea that I wanted to be a painter at one point, and then I came to New York and worked at Artist Space. And after spending a summer at Artist Space, I went back and like put away my paint and decided I wanted to try to figure out what it meant to be an artist and not just sort of fit my ideas into painting. And that led to kind of weird drawing and writing practice for a long time. And the thing that like I've been focused on in the studio over the years has been this kind of trompe-l'oeil drawing. I was trying to explain to somebody who was doing sort of maximalist abstraction that I couldn't even begin to comment because most of my concern is like, is there a 10% value change in like a sheet of paper? Like very minor, sort of subtle things in the practice, in a lot of the work. And that, you know, doing these kind of watercolors for the last year and a half or so has been kind of liberating, and I feel a little bit like a painter in the studio. But I don't know, I don't have like an overriding aesthetic concern that drives the work. I feel fairly like an anti-formalist or something. That I make artworks, but I think I gave a lecture once and somebody in the audience was like, that's all fine, but that's not art. I was like, cool. So I guess I can't bracket out the content from the work, and I always find that they're sort of fused together, and that what makes the artwork is sort of self-evident.
Hey, thanks. I actually, one of the more kind of, I guess, revelatory things about your talk for me was that, this is not a question, but I'll get to my question, it's more of a compliment, is that your kind of identification as this guilty white person navigating a white art world, which I think is maybe something that could happen more often, is kind of not kind of hiding behind that neutrality, considering that all work is kind of identity work, in my opinion. So thanks for that. But my question is more about wage. Today, actually, I'm thinking about this a lot because I got paid by wage for a group show that I was in, which is like, blew my mind.
It's possible. It will happen. We can change culture.
Like $150.
Yeah, I did too from a show about
Not a lot of
Marx.
money, but it was like, made me think of every other group show I've been in that I've never been paid for.
Right. You probably lost money on it because you invested time and energy.
And just like think of the $150 that I didn't make each time. But it also kind of made me realize the conversation that I'd been having about wage with other artists, which was always kind of like about this idealization of the concept and how it was just like so good on paper, but there's so many times where you obviously wouldn't turn down a show because you weren't getting paid $150. And then trying to kind of like, I guess, getting that $150 was so wonderful, it made me rethink that. But I think that more to my question is like, collectively, I think there's kind of a maybe even like a reticence to kind of acknowledge that. So going forward, what do you think a game plan is?
Well, when Lise Soscone, who's pretty much the heart of Wage at this point, A.L. Steiner and some of the other kind of founders support her, but Lise does most of the work. She did a focus group for Wage about 1.5 years ago, where she brought in a lot of different artists from different areas and sat everyone down and started, proposed what the Wagency model would be. And there were like immediate sort of fights amongst the audience, like how can we even talk about commodity, or how can we even talk about labor and money? We're not doing this for that. And the kind of divide in the audience was really telling. It's hard to organize artists for a lot of reasons, in part because it is so individually oriented. To like take on a collective identity is pretty hard when we've invested so much in sort of personal vision. So one of the things that came out of that meeting, though, in that focus group, was that whatever Wagency is right now, it's another step. Like the artist certification fee that got you that $150, there's more than 40 institutions that are now Wage certified. So if that keeps growing, then the next step is to get artists to sort of like commit to asking for that fee, and that the model now isn't like you're either Wage certified or you're not, and you have to turn down shows. It happens on a kind of transactional relationship where you see which shows an artist has done, where they were certified and where they weren't. And the way they put it, they're like, you're as good as your last transaction or your last show. And that's tough, but it's not like you're banished from the group. And it acknowledges that it's going to be a slow change. And then the third thing in that was that it starts to create the outlines for what might be an artist union, where the other aspects of being an artist could be addressed. But you need to draw people in and get that kind of like, be able to put your name on something, like joining the Democratic Socialists. They still run candidates on the Democratic platform or sponsor Green candidates, but they're working within the kind of existing political system. So I think Wage is probably the only thing I can point to that is setting something up that could have the outlines for that kind of group identity for artists to kind of get behind collectively. So it's going to take a while, though.
So I have a little question about the timeline, and I think that one of the things that is kind of like is great, but one of the things that is missing is like the quality of life has changed over time. Like 100 years ago, there was oppression, so women couldn't vote, LGBT people didn't have any rights, people of color couldn't vote, and then that has changed. So in a sense, society has gotten better, just based on the facts. And that's not something that we kind of see there. Like, while it is true that in the 1900s, there was some less income inequality. You also had kids that were 6 years old. They were working in factories, and that's not really accounted for. Another thing is that the poverty level, has consistently the extreme poverty level has consistently decreased, over the last 4 or 5 decades. And this is well documented. So there's like positive elements that I'm not really sure that are being projected.
Yeah, no, I mean I've tried to account for like the civil rights movement, the feminist movement. I'm aware of like, do you know Steven Pinker, the writer, like Our Better Angels? He's someone who's sort of looking at positive growth in society, sort of in general. and that we have seen quite a few improvements. This is like a dystopian sci-fi projection, and I am trying to sort of like, for every instance of whether it's Trump or something negative, that there is, Supreme Court overturns Defense of Marriage Act. It's an image from San Francisco. That there are these sort of positive moments, and I still think Occupy Wall Street is an incredibly positive, symbolic moment of kind of pushing back against regressive changes. And I just can't also take it for granted, considering the way in which courts and politicians are trying to overturn voting rights right now, that progress, that linear progress, is always going to be headed in a positive direction. And so that this is partially a warning, and that part of the frustration is for every sort of movement to kind of protest and try to push back against regressive changes, terrible things are sort of still following them. So I wish I was more of an optimist and could write like the Steven Pinker version of society, but I'm more on the Piketty side, which is also like historical document and factual analysis, and really trying to warn people, like the kind of climate change report that just came out, that we could be heading for like some really terrible, futures if we don't change our own behaviors.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, because I'm glad that you showed that information, because it just seems like the emphasis was more on the negative. But there's a lot of positive things that have been happening.
I mean, Black Panther was also a great Marvel movie, and I can also criticize the franchising or the lack of like new original films that aren't based on previously existing sort of content. But I don't know. Hopefully there are some things in here that are decent positive developments.
Yeah.
Is this an ongoing project, like you're going to edit and add to and continue the timeline, or is this
I made just an all text version of this that was sort of like a museum didactic that was wholly unsatisfying as a drawing. It was like museum font, it has to be a certain size so it can be legible to audiences. And it was really, really produced from the sort of point of view of a museum that's sort of representing the victor. Like, we've had the great restoration of wealth and we've done very well. Sorry about everything else, So this was I was trying to like editorialize a little bit more within that framework. And it's possible that this, could take on a different form or life, but I think the overall project I'm not quite done with it yet.